So there's a picture of the book. Book authors don't pick their cover. On a scale of 1 to 10, you give it a 6? Tough crowd. Princeton Press just published it, and Princeton Press is a wonderful press to work with. Folks, there's my co-author, Siqi. Siqi, I do not speak Chinese, but I visit China every year. And Siqi and I have been working together for 10 years. And I now know so much more about China, and hopefully I've taught her some things about environmental and urban economics. She's one of the world's leading experts on real estate in the developing world, and she's a formidable intellect who views me as lazy and undisciplined as a thinker, but she does acknowledge that I'm creative, and she loves visiting Los Angeles, and absolutely brilliant co-author. And we talk by email every day. And when you work with someone from Asia, while you're asleep, they're working, and vice versa. And so the team always is making progress. And that makes me optimistic about our progress. Folks, it's bad form to show book blurbs, but Ed Glazer is a good friend of mine. I want you to focus on the last 2 lines. In an age of environmental pessimism, Kahn and Siqi Zheng provide an optimistic counterpoint with wit and wisdom. If I have an epitaph, I'd like it to be that of optimism, wit and wisdom, and let's just get it started. Your time is scarce. And from another friend of mine, Siqi Zheng, this gives you a sense of where we tried to position the book. So I'm grateful to him for saying nice things about the book. But this is about what we're about to do. As Clay eloquently said, we're about to be talking about environmental and urban economics, and centered in a very important nation that has made a choice until recently to sacrifice quality of life in the name of rising out of poverty and having a more booming economy. So folks, the conventional wisdom, for those who read the New York Times each day, there's almost a monthly article about the challenges that China's environment faces. Here's a picture from The Economist magazine. Is this a Chinese dragon? Can anyone DNA test this dragon? It looks like this dragon has some bad intentions for the globe. Tough crowd. So the conventional wisdom among Western intellectuals is of great environmental challenges in China. That dragon's roughing up the globe. Tough afternoon crowd. I am part a statistician, and I'm always thinking about data. That what Siqi and I have been up to in a series of projects, one measure of ambient air pollution is particulate matter, PM10. Epidemiologists have documented that particulate matter raises morbidity and mortality risk. We've got about 85 cities here, and we're graphing average pollution exposure in China from the years 2002 to 2012. And maybe the easiest thing to digest are the triangles. Notice that there has been some progress. These are very high pollution levels, as I'll show you in a moment. But air pollution has been getting better. Don't ask me about the 2011 blip. But during a time of economic growth across China, air pollution has been getting better. We can talk about data quality a little bit later and whether the Chinese Communist Party has the incentives to measure air pollution. And we will come back to blue sky days a little bit later. Folks, here's another graph, graphing PM10. Does everyone remember the 2008 Olympics in Beijing? One thing I'd like you to take away, as you look at this chart, so keep in mind the following. Los Angeles's particulate levels are at 40, much lower than Beijing. But the good news is, do you see the downward trend that air pollution is getting better in Beijing? But folks, do you notice the natural experiment? That when the Olympics took place, do you see that huge progress of the drop in PM10? And it is true that when the Olympics were over, the pollution went up, but it didn't revert to the old mean. So I'm always an optimist. My mother tells me not to engage in wishful thinking, but I'm always looking for good news. Do I have any optimists in this room? But let us beware wishful thinking, Mom. My mother's a lawyer. During a time of population growth and per capita income growth, Beijing's pollution has declined. I'm fascinated by this race in capitalism between the quantity and quality of economic activity, and I'll be coming back to this throughout my brief talk. Folks, can everyone hear me, or should I boom? Clay has warned me I will be playing against the marching band, but it's a fair opponent. Folks, as Clay alluded to, I'm interested in both local environmental challenges, like air pollution, water pollution, food quality, but all of us are interested in the challenge of climate change. In this graph, I'm using data from the World Bank. Time goes from the year 1960, time ends in the year 2008. Don't ask me why. These are World Bank data. I'm graphing for you per capita, so per person, I'm graphing carbon dioxide emissions, and we all know that carbon dioxide contributes to the risk of climate change. I'm showing you the world's emissions. Folks, do you view India as a growing country? India are the squares. Do you see a mild positive trend line there? Take a look at China. Do you see an unintended consequence of China's explosive growth during the first decade of this millennia, an explosion in carbon emissions? This is a tribute to China's amazing economic growth over the last decade, but China's growth, given that it's such a big country, has exacerbated the challenge of climate change. Will this continue? Is a question we're going to talk about. A reasonable question. I have many friends in this audience, and I'm grateful, and I hope to make some new friends. But I have many friends in the audience, only one of which I know two of which I know are economists. What can a microeconomist do here? What Siqi and I try to do in the book, and I'm going to be telling you about the chapters and then opening up and answering any of your questions. We first are going to explore the causes of China's pollution, the role of households, firms, and government. Folks, nobody intends to produce pollution. Nobody. I don't even think Donald Trump would take pleasure in producing pollution. Pollution is a byproduct of our life. How did you get here today? To produce that bottle of water I drank, what pollution was created? To produce my shoes, what pollution was created? Pollution is a byproduct of economic activity. And if we change the rules of the game, if we have pollution taxes, if we encourage green research and development, we have ways to have trade-offs, to have cleaner conditions with the same level of economic growth. Siqi and I are also going to talk about the consequences of pollution exposure. Many Chinese children don't have a sibling. We're going to talk about 4-2-1. I only have one child, and my wife and I spend a lot of time, perhaps too much time, fretting over our little prince. And so with only one child, when you've bet it all on only one child, like many Chinese parents, incredible incentives to think through for him or her in an age of human capital. How do you develop a child so that he or she can reach her full potential? And the role of clean air, clean water, and clean food to raise the probability that each Chinese child achieves her full capability. Political economy. The Chinese Communist Party is roughed up a fair bit in the New York Times. And we could talk about this. We could talk about this. I'm fascinated at the state and local level. Does this one-party state have incentives to address pollution challenges? And I'm going to argue that it does in some of the more controversial parts of the book on political economy of fighting pollution. And I will get us there, but I will watch the clock as well. Today's book talk. What's the best part of each of our chapters? And as usual, I'm trying to generate some buzz. So please tweet. Chapter 1. We rewrote chapter 1 numerous times as my editor said that I'm not sexy. I said, I'm well aware that I'm not sexy. And here's the final chapter 1 that came out. Something terrific that Siqi did in the book is we interview many Chinese people. We interview poor people, middle-class people, rich people. We interview mayors. We interview all these people. We change all of their names and give them new names. But Siqi interviewed, I'd say, half of China. That was a joke. And we start the book with an interview with Mr. Wu. And Mr. Wu, who I've never met, told us about his life, that he's in his 50s, and he sees the great progress that has occurred over the last 30 years. But this is a stressed out man, worried about his daughter's education, working very long hours, a long commute, young people worried about house prices, worried about food quality, worried about pollution. And what we try to start the book with, and Clay alluded to this in his introductory remarks, is we almost like sociologists, we want to set the scene on what it's like to live in modern urban China. If you're a professor, if you're middle class, if you're poor, and we're trying to contribute to the standard of living debates. Economists are not as naive as some of our critics think we are. We don't just use GNP growth as a sufficient statistic for well-being. Our colleague Dick Easterlin has done some great work documenting that the Chinese, while China has experienced great per capita income growth, people in China are not reporting proportional increases in life satisfaction. And one possible mechanism for that fact is that pollution has grown worse at the same time that income has grown. When I teach my undergraduates, I talk about the time machine. One way to test whether China in 2016 is better than during Mao's time is whether anyone would pay to get in a time machine to go back and live in Mao's time. Good. I'm glad I'm among, there's a reason I left UCLA. That was funny. At UCLA, that wouldn't have been funny. In the last part of chapter 1, we get into Siqi's life, and we talk about one day in Siqi's life of what it's like to live in Beijing in February. And her using, Siqi has a young son who she wants to protect from the pollution. Because she's a professor, she has a flexible schedule, and she goes to work. I will not reveal too much about Siqi, but we talk about her use of her Apple app, informing her about pollution that day. That affects her choices of how she commutes, whether she takes her bicycle, so to protect herself from pollution, she will drive her car on polluted days. Folks, did I have a laugh to that? And so I found that funny in a horrible way, and that's in the book. We tell all. And so we walk you through Siqi's day on what she does to protect herself and her family. For example, on weekends she takes her whole family, her parents, her husband, her son, and herself, and they take their car that they recently bought and drive out to the clean suburbs to pick fruit and just to get the heck out of the city. It sounds a lot like Americans. And so one of my themes in writing this book with Siqi is what the Chinese people have in common, that there's many commonalities between urbanites and big cities, and exploring this in our work. Chapter 2. Chapter 2 is a little bit boring, but we have to do this. What chapter 2 is about is China as an industrial juggernaut. Folks, has anyone bought a product that on the back says made in China? For example, Siqi came up with this great fact that 80% of the world's Christmas presents are produced in China. And maybe 90% of American flags, I don't know. So we've got a variety of interesting facts. A starting point in economics, in Econ 101, is that nations will focus their economy on what their comparative advantage is. And for years, China had an edge in being a leading manufacturer, and our Rust Belt in the United States has lost hundreds of thousands of jobs because of this, because China, in part because of its huge man and woman power, in part because of the powerful hand of the CCP, China featured low wages, cheap land for industrial production, cheap energy, and no environmental regulation. Folks, I think even I could figure out how to make money as a manufacturer if you offer me these conditions. And China chose, in part because of its endowments, but also as a conscious choice to have cheap energy, it chose to burn coal. Many of China's local and global environmental problems are caused by this burning coal. But folks, we need to be careful. Everything in life, including listening to me for the next 30 minutes, has costs and benefits. By burning the coal, by becoming an industrial powerhouse, China lifted its economy out of poverty. I don't think Mao would recognize modern China. Life expectancy has increased, but an unintended consequence of China burning that coal has been a huge increase in air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. And a theme we talk about in our book is, moving forward, can China do better? And will China do better? And we think yes, as it becomes a brains and human capital economy. What we talk about in chapter 2, and again, I view this as the most boring chapter in our book, we point to the Pittsburgh story. Is anyone here from Pittsburgh? Pittsburgh used to be the steel capital of the US, and an unintended consequence of that comparative advantage was heavy steel production and horrible pollution. Pittsburgh now is centered around Carnegie Mellon and the University of Pittsburgh, and it's a brains economy, making a transition from heavy polluting as the golden goose to the service sector and hospitals and high tech. And what Siqi and I argue in chapter 2 is every Chinese city needs to think through what is its comparative advantage. Moving forward, what is it relatively good at? And the algebra here is not to put you to sleep. What I want you to think about is that a booming city can have environmental progress if economic growth occurs, but if pollution per unit of economic growth is decreasing faster than the economic growth is taking place. And that's what I'm calling the Great Race. For long-term residents of Los Angeles, we've had huge progress in air pollution, both because of car regulation, but also because of deindustrialization. Government gets a lot of credit for Los Angeles's improvement in air quality, and what economists would call that is cleaner technique. Will the Chinese Communist Party choose to introduce the costly ways to reduce economic growth's pollution effects? We'll talk about that at the end of my talk today. Folks, coal one last time. I'm taking coal data. So does everyone see I'm dividing the world into China and the rest of the world? Do you see in 1990 a little bit of a gap between China's coal consumption before the rest of the world, and do you see convergence such that by the year 2012, China's coal consumption equaled the rest of the world, even though the rest of the world, has 7.3 billion people minus 1.3 billion people. So there's 6 billion people in the rest of the world. There's 1.3 billion people in China. Yeah, congratulations, China. You caught up to the rest of the world. And burning coal has costs and benefits. But moving forward, as China needs more energy for everything we use energy for, does it have to keep being coal? I want to give you some optimism from urban economics, and I apologize that this is a busy slide. In the United States, many of our major cities like Pittsburgh, Chicago, New York City, Los Angeles have experienced air quality progress as they deindustrialized. The reason big cities in the US and big cities in China deindustrialize is because manufacturing is land intensive. Folks, have you seen some successful Chinese real estate developers? Chinese real estate developers can get rich if they can take a centrally located manufacturing state-owned enterprise, clear out that cement maker, clean up the crap that those guys left, and remediate the pollution, and then take that same land and sell that as skyscrapers. So the mayors of big cities actually have an incentive to deindustrialize because of opportunity cost. Manufacturing takes place in very low-rise buildings. Land can be much more efficiently used if you convert this land into high-rise buildings. Wages are rising in China's cities. That's what economic development does. Environmental regulation is rising in these cities. Siqi and I have studied this in a series of technical papers. What this means is a deflection effect. As these factors play out in China's rich coastal cities like Shanghai, manufacturing plants are either going to move to the rest of Asia or they're going to move inland to the poorer Western regions. Folks, now I want to say something smart. Many young environmentalists, when I present these arguments, say, Professor, I'm worried that this is going to be a zero-sum game, that yes, Beijing and Eastern China might clean up, but that this will lead to pollution degradation in Western China. What I push back are these 2 points, and this needs to be studied on a case-by-case basis. As engineers make progress, when you shut a factory, it doesn't just get up and walk to a new location. You build a new factory in the new location. If the new factory has embedded into it cleaner technology, then it's not a zero-sum game for pollution. And also, because the Western cities have fewer people, fewer victims are exposed to the pollution. And these points need to be thought through. Folks, another issue that Siqi has taught me in the case of Hong Kong and Beijing is that both of these cities are experiencing pollution exposure because pollution is blowing in. For example, can folks help me with my pronunciation? You don't want to hear my Chinese pronunciation. Let's hear it. Hebei. Who knows what I was going to say? That there's many steel factories here whose pollution is blowing into Beijing. And so what we talk about in the book is that both in the case of Hong Kong and Beijing, Hong Kong is paying manufacturers located outside the jurisdiction, but within the province, to install emissions reduction technology. There's gains to trade here. If I have any lawyers here, this is the Coates theorem at work of providing incentives to the polluters. The victims of the pollution are rich and sophisticated and are providing resources to the polluters to clean their act up. This is one way to mitigate a pollution challenge. Folks, 3 more points about in chapter 2 before I boogie on. Have you noticed that there's more Chinese MBAs? And I have Warden here that should say Marshall. As there is a professionalization of Chinese managers, there's a literature in management economics that professional managers are more efficient. Nick Bloom of Stanford has recent work that firms with better managers are more energy efficient. As you have a more professional managerial class, because of China's growing elite universities, you'll have more efficient operations. The Chinese are very willing to import new ideas and technologies from others. Ask Bill Gates. That was a joke. But in the case of green technology, there's all sorts of possibilities for green technology figured out here in California, whether it's the electric vehicle or solar panels, to be exported to China. China's government is anticipating that the green economy in the rest of the world is going to take off and is making strategic investments, encouraging its firms to embrace the green economy as a future export market. All of these portend a reduction in China's pollution from its industrial sector. More optimism from energy economics about manufacturing. Until recently, 80% of China's power was generated by coal. But as natural gas gets ever cheaper, there's going to be this substitution from coal to natural gas. There's an awkward question for environmentalists whether substituting to nuclear power is good or bad. But in the case of fighting climate change, this is a good thing. China will be changing, based on its COP21 promises at the December 2015 global treaty, China will be increasing its renewables and moving away in part from coal. Final point here, a point that optimistic economists argue is that ideas are public goods. If a USC engineer comes up with a new green idea, that idea can diffuse widely and to China and be adopted everywhere. So as the technological frontier advances, China is both playing a role with its universities as a producer of frontier knowledge, but it's also a consumer of those ideas, and to decouple greenhouse gas production from economic growth. Folks, the next thing we talk about in the book is the migration to cities. China is relaxing its hukou system. Can you believe this fact? China's planners are expecting 300 million more urbanites to move to, new urbanites over the next few decades, a whole United States to pop up. The scale of China is remarkable. As the hukou system is relaxed, so China used to have this domestic passport system, and as that is weakened, you get into Chinese urbanites having a menu to choose from. In the United States, when urban economists such as me have studied what are the best cities to live in, you quickly see there's trade-offs. Folks, can we all agree that Los Angeles is heaven, but this is an expensive city? You can trade a Westwood house for 100 Detroit homes. There's trade-offs. You folks could move to Detroit. And the Chinese people will have choices across their cities. And economic theory predicts that home prices will adjust. Home prices will be higher in cities with great amenities and cities with great job opportunities. There's always trade-offs. And the Chinese people will face a menu of where they want to live. Now, there's a question in China for household choices. Let's jump to this one. China used to have a low carbon footprint when nobody had air conditioning. So we wrote into the book that Siqi's family bought their first air conditioner when Siqi was 20. Siqi's parents visited their first dentist when they were 60. And so this is a different perspective than what I remember about my life. As China grows, so one way to be sustainable is to be very poor. That was only a half joke. As a nation grows richer, can it remain sustainable? And the question is, if Chinese people, like everyone else, want air conditioning or want to be cool and temperate, which cities offer these services? Are there ways to have electricity without the greenhouse gas implications? Can power be generated using wind and renewables? And these are all questions we discuss. Something new. And I think I want to do it like this. For those of you who haven't been to China, many Chinese people live in apartment towers rather than in single-family homes. Siqi and I wrote a paper. Let's do it like this. Let me jump a little and tell you about our bullet train paper. How many of you have been on a Chinese bullet train? So I have even ridden one by myself. My friend in Tianjin thought I would end up in North Korea, but I made it back to Beijing by myself and successfully. Folks, Siqi and I wrote a well-known paper on bullet trains, and here's what we did. There's doom and gloomers in urban development theory who talk about megacities. They say that there's megacities in the developing world, such as Beijing and Shanghai, and China's now a middle-income country, but that people just keep moving to the megacities, and as they do, the quality of life in these cities goes to hell. Siqi and I wrote a safety valve paper where, let me say this slowly. Folks, there are cities like Tianjin, which is 40 miles from Beijing. Can everyone read with me? Before the bullet trains were built in 2009, the average commute time, one-way commute time, was about 2 hours to get from Tianjin to Beijing. With the bullet train, it's now 30 minutes. Siqi and I argued that the bullet train effectively creates second-tier cities become suburbs of the superstar cities. Folks, this creates freedom in a communist country. If there are people who find Beijing unlivable, too polluted, too expensive, too crowded, with the bullet train, you can now have the best of both worlds of living in a slower, less high-paced city and once a week using the bullet train to go to Beijing. Siqi's a real estate expert, so what we did was we took all the real estate transactions for the last decade in China, and we documented that home prices are going up more in second-tier cities connected by bullet train to the superstar cities than in other cities equidistant to the superstar cities, but that were not connected by bullet train, if that makes sense to anyone. And so to say that a little more slowly, let's come here and do it again. As house prices have soared in cities like Beijing and Shanghai, middle-class people in China's quality of life could sharply grow worse, just as we have an affordability issue here in Los Angeles. Advocates of the bullet train in California have said one argument, which I don't believe, is that Bakersfield could become a suburb of Los Angeles. But in the case of China, quality of life in second and third tier cities in bullet train commuting distance to the superstar cities creates improvements in quality of life and protects urbanites if the mega cities get too big, just as Philadelphia would have a real boom if Amtrak could move at more than 50 miles an hour. That was a joke, but as a New Yorker, if you think the Amtrak is going to pick up speed, then you should be purchasing in Philadelphia right now. And we talk in depth about these cities. I had a wonderful time in Chengdu. Many environmentalists are very interested in the issue of suburban sprawl. In the United States, many rich people live downtown, but some rich people live in the suburbs in new, large homes. What interests me in Siqi very much is as the Chinese grow richer, we talk about Yao Ming versus Michael Jordan at the start of this chapter. As the Chinese grow richer, will they continue to live in apartments or will they want their own single-family homes? The leader of China, President Xi, has talked about the Chinese dream. The American dream includes your own single detached home, your own lawn. That's a resource-intensive life. We talk in the book, as the Chinese people grow richer, will their cities begin to resemble ours? Will they give up using public transit? Will they switch to just driving cars? And we talk about the implications of these lifestyles for sustainability. A point that might interest folks is we talk about the city mayors using their muscle to take farmer land. So this is worth one moment on this. Folks, the mayors of China's cities know what they're doing. They will approach farmers and offer them the present discounted value of their vegetable flows and say, comrade, I'm going to pay you for your profit as a farmer. That's not much money. And then they sell the land to developers who value the land at the present discounted value of urban rents. You're supposed to laugh. Do you see the arbitrage there? Okay, you need to take my course. And so that's a money pump if you could pull that off. And so one of the reasons that Beijing now has a sixth ring road is because the urban mayors have been able to use this trick over and over again to purchase farmer land. Farmers are not being compensated at the Don Trump redevelopment level of this land. They're getting the farm rents. And that's if the farmers were given the present discounted value of the development as real estate, that would actually encourage developers to build within the city boundaries, not to keep sprawling out, but we can come back to that. In the name of time, let's push on. Siqi's an expert on real estate, and we do a very good job in the book for those of you interested in Chinese real estate. We talk about the issue of how Chinese real estate developers are acquiring land from farmers and from past manufacturing sites and converting the past manufacturing sites, which are brownfields, into properties you can build on. How they're partnering with the public government to build highways, electricity grids. There's a tight partnership between real estate developers and the government to provide the necessary infrastructure for these projects to work. One point I'd like to raise is that China's economy would be more sustainable if the new buildings being built are green buildings. Folks, are we in a green building right now? How old is this building? How long will this building last for? Buildings are long-lived, durable projects. The buildings China builds now could last for 50 or 60 years. What Siqi and I talk about in the book, so do you know that the United States has LEED and Energy Star to certify real estate as green? The Chinese are just launching that system now. And we have been, but if you don't have such a certification process, developers have no incentive to build such buildings because they won't command a price premium for characteristics you can't credibly signal that your building has. Does that make any sense? If your building's energy efficient, it took money to achieve that. But if you can't signal to potential buyers that it is energy efficient because they've never worked in your building, they're not going to pay a price premium. The way you solve this market failure is by having certifiers of information like Energy Star and LEED certification. But up until now, this hasn't worked. And this has inhibited the real estate sustainability push in China. And we talk at length about this in this chapter. Folks, cars are sort of an easy one. And in the name of time, I'm going to do this one quick. Actually, I've got a good slide on this. In 1990, there were 12 million vehicles in China. In 2020, there's going to be over 200 million. If China were to achieve the US car ownership rate, there will be 1 billion cars on the road. The environmental implications hinge on whether these cars run on gasoline or whether they run on electricity generated by renewable power. Folks, did you know there's a new economics paper that argues that electric vehicles can be brown if the power comes from coal? So in California, if you drive a Tesla, you're being green because our power is green. But if you drove a Tesla in Ohio, you're worse to Al Gore than a gasoline car driver because the EV's power is generated by coal. That's a new paper written by my friends coming out in the American Economic Review. So we talk in this chapter, it's very clear why the Chinese people demand cars. Cars are faster than public transit. I take public transit to USC every day, but I do not see many of my colleagues. I guess time is money. I am a New Yorker. Oh, Julian rides with me. It's good to see you, man. And that's, in China, as the Chinese grow richer, time is money. And there's also a status of having your own car. Siqi talks about when her baby was born that she didn't want to bring a baby on public transit. I think I understand these things. As an environmentalist, I still want that baby on board. But we talk at length that when people choose to purchase a car, they're not bad people. There's private benefits from purchasing such a car, and each individual has only weak incentives to internalize the externalities posed by those cars. But in such a large nation, these individually rational decisions add up to have social impacts. I'm going to speed through this. So Siqi bought her first car when she was 30, and this is what I meant about private benefits versus social costs. When Siqi drives her car, she has more time because she moves at a higher speed and she has greater convenience. But she contributes to the road congestion in Beijing and contributes to pollution. The one piece of optimism I want you to think about is Los Angeles has had a huge drop in its emissions from transportation because while we're driving more miles, we're driving cleaner cars. Did you know that because of the US Clean Air Act, new cars are 99% cleaner than cars built in the 1970s? Have you ever been behind one of these 1975 cars which doesn't have a catalytic converter? And China, to its credit, is now enacting Euro 6 standards to have much cleaner cars. They need cleaner gasoline. The state-owned enterprise Sinopec is being unwilling to refine gasoline to a higher level of quality because they can't pass the costs on to consumers because the communists have passed price caps on gasoline. But in Econ 101, we know this, but it's interesting to see this play out. But the Los Angeles is a credible case of a city where air quality and ozone smog have gotten much better during a time of economic growth because successful regulation has led to such a reduction in pollution per mile of driving. Quality can offset quantity. Last parts of the book. We argue at length that one of the main reasons we think that great progress will occur in China's cities is that China is going to make a big bet that the future of the Chinese economy is the brain. China has made such an investment in education. Have you met some Chinese people on this campus? I think that's a terrific thing. In the past, China's bet was on heavy factories. Right now, sort of wanting to build its own San Francisco, China is making a major bet on human capital. My friend Ed Glazer and Enrico Moretti, in books I recommend, have argued that human capital is the key to urban economic growth. Those cities that can attract, retain, and train skilled people grow. Detroit is poor because it does not attract, train, or retain skilled people. Chicago's cold. That is a city that's attracted, retained, and trained skilled workers. Those cities, whether they're in the US or China, that can attract and retain the skilled grow. The Chinese Communist Party understands this. Some Western cities in China will continue to use the old recipe of heavy industry, but they will pay the price for that. As I mentioned before, and Siqi is all too aware of this with her one child, China has 4-to-1 demography. And when you only have one child, there's a growing recognition, based both on the research of the Nobel laureate Jim Heckman and Princeton's Janet Curry, of the key role, if you want to be a well-developed young adult, the key role that having access to clean water, clean food, and clean air plays in fostering child development. So much of China's environmentalism is not Berkeley environmentalism. It's instrumentalism in growing a well-functioning child. And when you only have one child, you have all your eggs in one basket. And we talk about this at length in this chapter. Only one point here. In my joint work with my wife from a long time ago, we have found that as people and nations grow richer, their demand to be exposed to less risk, they're willing to pay more and more to be exposed to less risk. And thus, Siqi and I argue that those cities that do not deliver quality of life in China will experience a brain drain. And this incentivizes the mayors of these cities, these mayors who often act as entrepreneurs, that if high human capital people are the golden goose, and if high human capital people move away from cities with bad quality of life, you can combine those two ideas to predict that those cities with low quality of life won't grow. Folks, look at Los Angeles. I moved to this city. We've got many multi-million-dollar homes because of the great quality of life. There's nothing productive about Los Angeles. There's nothing productive about here. LA is a productive city because of its great quality of life, which has attracted the skilled to work here. Silicon Beach exists because these hipsters, smart pants, wanted to be near the beach. So my causality in my life's work goes from quality of life, attracting the skilled, creating the productivity clusters. That's my causality path. I want to show you two more things and wrap up. Siqi and I are both statisticians. I want to give you a sense of what Siqi and I do for a living. Siqi has data on every apartment sale in Beijing. And what Siqi and I did in our first paper together, folks, this is Beijing, these are the ring roads, the center is Tiananmen Square. We put on a map the locations of green space and air quality. Where are the key universities, including hers at Peking University? Where are the subway stops? And we asked the following question. In this communist nation, where is the price per square foot of real estate high? Economists learn about your preferences from market prices. So I'll say this again, since I'm starting to bore you guys. We asked, where is the price of real estate high in China, within China's cities? And we geocoded every apartment sale. So every one of these dots you see, I don't think I superimposed the dots. We asked, so the closer you are to the city center, the more expensive is housing. The closer you are to a fast subway station, the more expensive is housing. But in addition, the closer you are to green space and to the cleaner parts of the city, to the northwest, the more expensive is real estate. So this is a flavor of how we do empirical work. We infer from market transactions in this communist country. We learn about the Chinese people's preferences from what they do in markets. I never do survey research. I'm interested in what people do, how they reveal their tastes in markets. In our new work, we have scraped 180 million tweets in China, and we're working with big data scientists where we've merged all these tweets by day, by city, to the pollution that day, and we've documented that people tweet angrier, more emotional tweets on more polluted days. And we're going to roll out this paper in a week or two. So I'm always looking for new pieces of evidence to test. In this book, how much are the Chinese people willing to pay to be exposed to less pollution? And what would be convincing evidence that that's increasing and that they would demand that their government take action? Final section. As Siqi has taught me, under the old regime, the Chinese Communist Party under Mao was only interested in having a strong military and having an industrial base that perhaps enemies could not bomb. And so there was very little interest in environmental protection. Officials, there's no elections in China with the people. Officials were being judged on output-based criteria, how much output was produced. Mayors thus had no incentive to address pollution issues because they were being rewarded just for growth. And the standard play was just to attract a dirty factory along the conditions I listed early in my talk and just let them go to town with the pollution. At the time, there was no internet. The media, which was just a pawn of the government, just said, all hail the state. And there was no media participation during this time, and there was no Twitter or internet, my young people in the room. There was very weak civil society, perhaps no independent lawyers, weak public participation, and the state had a monopoly and followed this rule of getting richer and getting out of poverty. And as China got out of poverty, life expectancy did increase, but the pollution took place. But in recent years, the central government is now making a green push. I want to show you 4 arguments we advance for the Chinese government's green push. First, the national government may be responding to the rising demand of the urban middle class. Folks, this is sort of a median voter model in a world where people don't vote. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't have the firmest grasp on power. One way to continue to have power is to be loved by your people. You're more likely to be loved by your people if you're providing public goods that people want. If people want blue skies, then out of self-interest, the Chinese Communist Party actually has incentives to supply them, especially if due to technological change, it becomes cheaper to supply that. Second, China has ongoing domestic energy concerns. And if China is able to produce more renewable power, that actually reduces probabilities of blackouts as the planners plan for rising demand. Third, as I mentioned before, the Chinese government is always looking for new export markets. The world appears to be making a low carbon push, and for China to be an exporter in solar panels and electric vehicles, this could be a very profitable play to become part of the green economy, not out of Berkeley hippieism, but just out of smelling future export markets. Alex Wong of UCLA has advanced this one. The last explanation is that the central government seeks legitimacy with its own people, and that pursuing environmental goals is one way to signal to domestic constituents and to the rest of the world that China is an international leader. The New York Times often paints China as a villain. As China grows richer, maybe there is a public relations attempt and perhaps a legitimate attempt to change its rep. So in our last work, and this is the last point I want to make, the good news for you is the book has 10 chapters. We talk about local officials' incentives to go green. So in China, local mayors have a lot of power. Even though the people don't vote, local officials are now being judged on an increased set of promotion criteria. They're now being judged, in addition to GDP growth and the absence of social riots, on pollution criteria. So they're actually now face some incentives to tackle energy efficiency and to reduce air pollution. And we've documented that they're responding to these incentives. Also, when we talk to mayors, the mayors are well aware of this human capital channel, that their people want improved quality of life, and that there will be fewer protests if quality of life improves. Final 2 points. Unlike in the past, in this Twitter age, the Chinese people are well aware about their pollution exposure. You all know the story that we talk about in the book about the US Embassy having its own Twitter feed telling the people what is the local PM 2.5. The Chinese communists have lost their information monopoly. When there's a duopoly, when you face competition, UCLA is going to have to raise its teaching quality as USC makes its rise to be Stanford's equal. Competition is a good thing. The communists hadn't faced enough competition, no longer have a monopoly on information, and now as the truth gets out through microblogs, many Chinese urbanites have traveled abroad and know what blue skies are like. And this is how you bring about accountability, even in a one-party state. And the ability to vote with your feet means that if a quality of life in one Chinese city is bad, these individuals can move out. So self-interested mayors facing green performance incentives now have incentives to try out new ideas, to build greener buildings, to introduce economic incentives to increase sustainability, to try to learn from each other, to try to learn what is cost effective. And a greener, at low cost set of Chinese cities emerges. The Chinese mayors know that they don't know what are the most cost effective strategies, but experimentation is the key to figuring that out. Conclusion. Our optimism about the rise of China's future blue skies hinges on the following. And we would reject our thesis if this does not play out. The rising middle class demand for quality of life, increased information transparency that brings about accountability for government and firms, the inclusion of sustainability criteria into local politicians' performance criteria, mayors experimenting and competing against each other, China continuing to receive technology from the rest of the world to decouple economic growth from pollution. And I think as President Xi talks about the Chinese dream and talks about what quality growth is, I think that our book is he hasn't actually explained what quality growth is, but I think what's going to emerge is 6% economic growth without the same pollution degradation. That would lead to a true rising standard of living for China's growing urbanites. Folks, thank you very much.